You are up straight to me. Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here today. And since it is a smaller group, then it would be great if you're good with being on camera. No one's required to, but I know full well when I'm not on camera, I find it easier to slip away and do something else while technically the machine is still running. So it does actually help get all of us to be present so that we can have some discussions. And as much as possible, I want to be answering the questions that really matter to all of you. I have tried to make some predictions, and we're going to talk about some of those things. But if under this topic of maintaining confidentiality in an elder abuse enhanced MDT meeting, if there are different questions you want to ask, then let's get them out. And we're going to try to sort of balance that today. Ask your questions as you have them. So you can either use the chat, and I will keep that open and keep an eye on it, or you can raise your hand electronically is the best way, because then it puts your name at the top of the list and I can keep track of it. And I will either take your question. I'm going to take your question and I want you to trust me. I'll take it when it makes the most sense. So if it's right away, it's because that's when it makes the most sense. If I know I'm going to cover it, then I may hold it. If it is important, but not immediately what we're discussing, then we'll do it at the end. And if everybody can make sure you're muted, unless you're asking a question and or contributing. And then when you're not talking, if you stay muted, then we avoid background interference. So for those of you who haven't been online with me before, my name's Alicia Aiken. I am a lawyer out of Chicago. I spent 15 years in legal aid, I had a specialty in representing survivors of violence, but I was also a generalist legal services lawyer sort of across the board. What I shifted to about 10 years ago is originally, I thought I was focusing on confidentiality and privacy. And what I have come to realize is that I'm really focusing on how do we communicate with each other? How do we communicate across professions? How do we collaborate with each other? And how do we build the kind of engagements that are free from abuse of power that we want to see in the world? Right? If we're trying to build a world where we are addressing violence and abuse of power, it doesn't help if we are reproducing some of those behaviors, maybe entirely unintentionally, in the way that we engage with elders, with their guardians and caregivers, with our colleagues. We want to bring our best humanity to all of those situations. And so that's what we do. That is what we work on. For some reason, I'm having a hard time finding my next arrow button today. Today's presentation is made possible by the Office of Victim Crime. Thank you very much. While they are funding this and supporting it and certainly supporting me as a presenter, just remember that the words that come out of my mouth are my opinions and may not be those of the federal government. Whoops. Okay, we're going to start with a poll. Which don't worry about it so much on the screen. I'm going to launch it as a poll. There's a lot of options here, so I want you to take your time to think about it. I'm going to read through the options. Don't worry, I'll give you plenty of time. The question is, what tools does your enhanced MDT use to protect confidentiality? So one option is signing confidentiality acknowledgements at each meeting. Another is reciting core statements of confidentiality at each meeting. Another is signing MOUs that describe what information the members can share with the group. Another is signing MOUs that describe what information the members of the group can use beyond the group. And finally, only sharing sensitive or protected information with the members who need it, not the whole group. I don't know why I said finally. There's two more options. Limit note-taking to action items and referral requests. And collect and shred documents at the close of the meeting. So check all of the ones that reflect something that you do in your groups. All right. I want to make sure everybody has a full chance. I'm going to give it about 15 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and I'm going to launch it, and then I want us to talk about it. I want us to talk about sort of what folks do and why they do it. I'm going to share the results. So you should all be able to see the poll up on the screen, see it with the options. If you don't see all the options, I think you can drag out your box to make it bigger so you can see everything. So choose one of the things that you do in your group to protect confidentiality, and then I would like folks to talk about it. So either using the chat or unmuting yourself. What's one of the things that you voted that you do, and why do you do it? How does it help? Don't everybody wait for someone else to go first.
Come on, folks, y'all can jump on in. So Linda
Hi,
says,
how are you?
Hello.
So for me, we haven't really had our first official meeting, but I do know that the number one thing that we plan to do is making sure that all confidentiality agreements are signed at each meeting, because it kind of sets the precedence in terms of what's expected from each member of that team, what's not expected, what's allowed, and from that piece of document kind of triggers everything else that's underneath it. So I think that's the most important one. Even though I selected a few other ones, but I think signing the confidentiality agreement at the beginning of each meeting is the most important thing, because everyone needs to know what's allowed and what's not allowed, and it sets the tone of the meeting.
Okay, great. That is really helpful insight. Do you have the confidentiality agreement written yet?
My supervisors we're doing the revision tomorrow, and then once we finalize that, that will be the one we use.
Can I ask a question? How long is it?
It's about a page.
Okay, that's good. Because what is implied when we have people sign the confidentiality agreement each meeting? What are we implying? Any of us, anybody can answer this question. You can phone a friend. When we sign something, what are we implying?
that we agree with the whole part of it and we're going to adhere to it.
That we agree with the whole part of it, and the only way we could agree with the whole part of it for reals is if we've what?
Read the whole thing.
Read it and understood it.
Oh, now you're just pushing things.
So this is a big deal, right? Because I think it's interesting when I have talks with folks and we talk about signing confidentiality agreements at the beginning of each meeting, I often have a negative reaction. And I tried to sit back and be like, why am I having a negative reaction to that? Because I completely agree with you. It is setting culture. It is setting intention. And I realized that the part that I'm nervous about is anybody actually reading it? Do they know what's in it? Are they making a choice to agree to it? Or is it a rote action, the way that, like, I can't pick up my rental car from Enterprise unless I agree to put my initials at the bottom of an electronic document that I 100% have not read, right? So it's not setting my intention, it's getting my car. And so I think that we want to make sure that we're using that signing of confidentiality agreements as a real tool. And to a large extent, that means keeping the lawyers' mitts off of it, because lawyers, unfortunately, my people, are taught to write things in such a way that they will make an excellent technical legal defense should there be a dispute later, rather than being taught to write things so that they communicate meaning to regular folks that makes sense to them. So thinking about not just the process of signing, but what do we think people mean when they sign, and how do we facilitate them doing that? How do we make time at the beginning of the meeting? Like, thank you everyone for being here at 1. The meeting has now started. We're going to give everybody 5 minutes to read the confidentiality agreement before we get going. Although another way of setting intention at the beginning of each meeting is reciting core statements of confidentiality at each meeting, which 3 of you said that you do. And I'm wondering if somebody could weigh in on how you use that and how it works for you.
So some of the folks, I don't think any of these people, no, I don't think Bernadette did it, but have it as a way that you can, you have to click off on it before you can get into the waiting room. So
Okay.
you electronically have to agree to it before you move on. Bernadette, do y'all do that, or was that somebody else?
No, we don't. Basically, it is the first thing you see when you log onto our Zoom platform.
Mm-hmm.
Once we get started with the meeting, I usually ask, has everybody read through it? And they'll say yes, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's a really interesting technique, right? That you have to use it. That to me almost feels like a kind of reciting the confidentiality at the beginning of each meeting, because you are putting it up on the screen and people need to acknowledge it. I don't know. So I think we're recording this meeting, right? Which means everybody got a meeting being recorded notice that Zoom has started using. They didn't originally, but they use it now they developed it during the pandemic. And what's really interesting about that is I have clicked that a gazillion times. And now that I think about it, I actually don't know what it says. Right. It may be great. It may be that I've read it a gazillion times and I'm always good with it. But what I know is that it tends to come up as the meeting's starting. And I'm like, oh, I got to just click that thing so I can get into my meeting. So what that means is that the simpler the language that you use, and it might be that you're using really simpler language that refers back to more complex language, like your MOU or a more like lengthy formalized agreement that's been signed. But whether you're using words to recite core statements or you're doing a sort of a click to participate, as simple as possible, the plainest language possible. I don't care how educated and genius everybody in your group is. It's that cognitive load question. I'm trying to get in my meeting and get my meeting going. I need something that is as simple as possible to land, right? To actually have some meaning. It's one of the reasons why, like, right, 10-step programs, like they have a ritual that they start with. It is a very simple ritual. You introduce yourself, you acknowledge your issue, and then everyone says hello. It is a very simple ritual for a very complicated problem people are trying to deal with, but it's a way of setting intention. So think about simplicity when you're thinking about setting confidentiality. Somebody else, somebody want to talk about collecting and shredding documents at the close of the meeting? Talk about how you use that, why you use that, what it achieves.
We were doing that before we went virtual prior to the pandemic, and we would have the cases all printed up with all the information distributed to everybody. We still talked about confidentiality, but then afterwards we would collect all of them and shred. And say you were with Safe House Denver and you needed to be able to make contact with that victim afterwards, I would either let you keep your form because it had identifying information on it, or if it didn't have all the specifics they needed, I would give that to them privately. But otherwise, we'll let the forms leave the room.
Okay, so that's interesting, right? It's like a modified, like we generally assume there's no reason to carry any of this out of the room. However, if there is a reason let's talk and figure out the best way to do it. Right. So that's being intentional about how information gets carried out and used. Has anybody thought about how to, this goal of having folks not carry out documents, forms, materials, has anybody thought about how to achieve this goal in the virtual space?
So when we went virtual, we stopped making the forms, obviously. We went to PowerPoint, and I no longer provided all information. So it might be the case of Linda L, who's in my, whatever old white female, but I don't put in phone numbers, addresses, full last names.
Okay.
I don't know who's in the room with people who are participating in the meeting.
Oh, we're going to talk about that, right? Because that's an incredibly important thing. Whether we're sharing Linda L's address or last name or phone number, we're also sharing Linda L's medical needs, experience of violence, exploitation, resistances to participating in helping measures, right? And those things are, for Linda L, probably as private, possibly even more so than their address. So we'll definitely talk about that question of like controlling the room, which is a much harder thing to do virtually. Yeah, so I think a couple of things. I think part of setting culture, because it's when you physically grab the documents and say, hey, you're not walking out of this room until I take this back. When you use the virtual spaces, then you're thinking about things like, do we have a rule that says that nobody's allowed to screenshot what we're doing? Right, because you won't necessarily know. And I do that a lot. I'll be honest, I'm in a regular training and somebody is presenting something to me. I don't know if I'm going to get the slides later or not, or I just know I really want this one slide. I will screenshot it real quick on my laptop and hold on to it. So if you don't want people to do that, you have to have a rule and build a culture that they don't do that. I got in big trouble with my kids recently because I screenshotted something from one of their stories on Instagram, and they yelled at me because that is a huge cultural violation for teenagers, because the story is supposed to disappear and you are not supposed to save it. And I'm like, but it's just a picture of my son at a restaurant. But they have a strong culture around that. And they worry about whether people are violating that culture. You have to build your culture about, just because your machines can do it doesn't mean that it's okay in our culture for you to do it. So I just want to talk about one more thing on this. I think this poll is actually one of the most important things we can do to kind of see what's possible and what each other is doing. No one answered that they are using MOUs that describe what information members of the group can use or disclose beyond the group. So does anyone want to talk to me about that? Why do you think that you don't have those? Now that you're seeing it, are you thinking, oh, maybe we would want that? Or is it unnecessary?
So Alicia, you're saying that if I hear this much information about Miss Susie Q and I want to share that with the staff of the agency I'm from, to brainstorm with them other ideas, I may or may not be able to, depending upon what our agreement is.
Well, and that's the question, right? Like, what is your agreement? Because one of the things that's interesting about MDTs is I hear people saying we come together for a variety of reasons, but sometimes we're coming together to solve problems for an individual person. And we bring all these people together because these are really smart people who may be working with this individual person. But then everybody will say to me, oh, but what happens in the group doesn't leave the group. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense to me. You were talking about the person. Many of you are serving the person. Are you genuinely telling me that none of the information you're using in this group is then used later? And then why are you meeting, right? And so I think we might be skipping over some thought processes a little bit, where there are things like what came up earlier, Betsy said that, if you need that phone number and some background information to make the contact, then you are taking the information out of the group. You are using it beyond the group for the group's purposes in a way that the group understands and approves of, and is consistent with mission and values of the group. So thinking about what do our MOUs say, and I actually, we say sign MOUs because it implies that we've read them and we understand them, and that's a huge implication when it comes to MOUs. People really have to take the time to read them, take the time to understand them. But I think they should be descriptive of what is appropriate use or non-use of information in the group. And it could be that what it is if somebody in the group is like, if I want to use information beyond the group, I have to get permission from the group, or check in with the group, or check in with the project coordinator, or discuss it first. There might just be a procedure in place. Certainly, again, if you have law enforcement or prosecutors on the group, they have a constitutional rule that they have to share information with criminal defendants where it is helpful to the criminal defendant's case. So if they learn something in the group and there is a prosecution pending, they're going to have to share it. Your MOU should alert everyone to that. So really thinking about how do we use our documents to build our culture, and what's possible. And I'm not suggesting that every group has to use every one of these tools, but I want the folks thinking about the tools that are available to you.
So let me throw a question out, and if you're ready to move on, you can do so. But to say, well, we signed the MOU/confidentiality, and so that applies to my whole agency. And so therefore I can share whatever I want to with my agency because the agency signed the MOU.
So that's the question. I mean, Lisa, it's a fantastic question that needs to be worked out and discussed, because you have so many professions on an MOU where when I say it's confidential as a lawyer, in my brain, that 100% ethically gives me permission to share with anyone in my law firm. So when I go to a group and the group says this is confidential in the group, is the group saying to me, to you, you are not allowed to discuss outside of the group, which is, I go back to fatality reviews a lot because they have a very highly designed structure for information. So a fatality review team 100% means, yes, you lawyer, you are not allowed to share what you learned in this room outside of this room.
Right.
But other groups might be like, you're not allowed to share what you hear in this room outside of your agency. Right? If you have adult protective services folks in the group, do we really think it's sort of consistent with adult protective services role and goal to say what we learn in this room, we are not going to share with anyone else in APS? Maybe that's someone's position, but I'm guessing maybe not. So Lisa, thank you so much for raising that point, that we really, when we are talking about confidentiality, we need to be very clear. Do we mean no one outside of your agency or your organization is allowed to know what happened here? Or do we mean no one beyond you? And I'm not going to, because you have different groups in different communities that are sort of have different goals and structures. I am not here to tell you the one way to do it. What I am asking you to do is to have really specific conversations with a lot of clarity and asking folks to not make any assumptions. And that might even be a practice to say, what is it for each person in the group? So based on everything we've done and said so far, what do you assume you can or cannot do with information? Like, it literally asks people what their assumptions are and see if you can get them to articulate things. And if it's not consistent with what the group thinks it's doing, then you got to have a discussion about it. And this comes up because I see lots and lots of prosecutors and law enforcement officers sign confidentiality agreements that says they'll sign at the beginning of the meeting, I can't do anything with this information outside of this room. But if I were to go to them and say, if you hear something exculpatory in this meeting, what will you do with it? They would 100% all say, oh, I have to share it. Even though they had read the confidentiality agreement, they had signed it with intention, their assumption is that this exception is a thing that they will always live by because it's consistent with justice. And they make an assumption everyone else knows their exception, even if no one else knows it. We all do that. We all have little cultural things within our professions that we assume everyone else knows, and there's no reason for other people to know unless they've been told. And that is one of the trickiest parts of cross-profession collaboration. One group I worked with one time around Elder MDTs, sort of said, well, how do you know that the information in the room is allowed to be shared? Like there's a doctor sharing. How do you know the doctor's allowed to share? How do you know the therapist is allowed? How do you know the advocate's allowed? And the group said, oh, we just assume if someone's talking in the room, they got whatever their legal permission is. And I was like, are people required to say, I got legal permission to share this? And they were like, well, no, we just assume they wouldn't be sharing it unless they had gotten permission. So really paying attention to those assumptions that we make. And the assumption part comes into play as well when we're thinking about how to manage the room, how to manage the virtual room. So let's kind of jump into that. So a lot of, especially with the pandemic starting, people started asking me, can we do this? Can we do that? Can we have this kind of meeting on this kind of technology? And, this is the thing that we always point out, which is that the law is the turtle in the scenario, the tortoise, and technology is not just the rabbit, but it's the rabbit on wheels. It is moving faster than law knows how to keep up. And that's the same thing with innovation in the field. So your enhanced MDT groups are innovation. They are new ways of thinking about problem solving in a holistic way for people who are having, a 360-degree kind of problem, trying to come at it with a 360-degree kind of solution. And the law is still struggling to catch up and to imagine what you do and why you do it and how different professions would come together to do this. So I say this because sometimes it can be hard it can feel like the law doesn't give you clear answers because the capability of technology has moved so quickly that the law doesn't even imagine the kinds of things that are possible. So it doesn't have a clear answer. Then we have the pandemic. So we went from a world where, and you know what, somebody is not talking, but not on mute. So if everybody could just double check, because that reduces the background noise. Thank you. So what happened with the pandemic is we already lived in a world where technology moved faster than law and innovation moved faster than law. And then at literally whiplash speed, right? We all had to drop whatever we were doing, use our personal computers from our personal homes and start trying to figure out how to do work and address the needs of our community, which just went up during the pandemic rather than down. And it felt like everything was just a race car running all of us down. So we've all been in a space of trying to figure out quickly what's okay for the last couple of years. And I really like the advice that the National Network to End Domestic Violence gave people, which was like, make your best possible judgment calls now. That's what we were saying to people in April of 2020. But when this starts to slow down, when it gets better, don't just assume that the thing you started doing in April 2020 is okay to do forever. And so we're sort of at that point now, right? I mean, who knows, but we are trying to figure out what the world is going to look like going forward. What do we retain of the virtual capabilities because they were good, because they increased our ability to collaborate? And where do we need to put in more guardrails so that we use the tech, but it's more protective? Or where do we need to go back to some of the more traditional ways because they genuinely were better at achieving the outcomes that we wanted and protecting confidentiality? I forgot I had a slide. It's all about, we're trying to put in new guardrails. We're trying to figure out what we're doing. All right. So as we think about using virtual technology to do meetings, we'll just talk about that for a second, because sometimes we can focus on how things feel so different. We're going to talk about some of the differences and some of the challenges in running meetings with attention to confidentiality. But I want us to remember what's the same right? So we talked last week about understanding what kind of information certain team members can share or cannot share, or how they figure out what they can share. Those rules about what you can or can't share are the same in a virtual space. Law enforcement's disclosure requirements are the same in a virtual space. We still have to establish group norms about what our team is trying to achieve, what is appropriate information to share with the team. And we have to establish group norms about how it gets shared. And that's the part that is different if we're not in a room together, because we knew how to hand out a piece of paper and then ask for it back and shred it. But how are we physically sharing with each other, and how are we physically preventing further sharing in the virtual space is a complex thing, but having group norms is the same. We still have to remember how to talk about things. And then respect for each other, respecting the ethics of the various professions, respecting where we're all coming from, taking the time to get to know each other. It's weird, right? It can be harder online. I'm having this experience where there was an equity group among parents in my town that I was very involved in during the pandemic. And I'm running into people in town and realizing that I have been working very, very closely with them for 2 years, solely online, and I've never met them in person. And I can't decide if I know them well or not. Like, it's almost confusing because we haven't had those little side chats that you might have had just between the two of you in person. But then in some ways, if it's a big group, I've been much more front and center with their faces than I would have been if we were in a big boardroom together. So just really paying attention to human and group dynamics of how do we build, again, building culture, building a sense of team, and figuring out how we transition to in-person or don't transition to in-person. There are some people for whom being online is substantially better. Travel issues, capacity to participate. But there are some people for whom it is substantially harder because they don't have access to reliable internet, right? We've heard folks from tribal communities talking about they've always known how much of a struggle it is to use the internet in many rural and tribal land communities, and that it has been even harder, and it makes it harder to participate in groups. So there's some making judgment calls about, what do we keep and what do we go back to older ways. Let's talk about tech privacy. Maintaining the equipment that you use matters. Maintaining the equipment matters. So if you're going to be doing virtual meetings, you have to be paying attention to the machines that people are using. So those are things we talk about, like, are we making sure that the machines that people are using have the patches downloaded so that if there are security breaches out there in the world, your machine isn't vulnerable to them? How do we pay attention to if people are working from home? So we're in this world right now where it's like some people are working virtually, but they're from the office using office machinery. Some people are home. A lot of organizations and companies have given people office machinery to use at home. Or some people might just be like, it's just easier to do this call on my phone. And it's my phone, not the agency's phone. So whatever equipment is being used, we have to pay attention to protecting the security of it from unknown hackers and protecting it from our own family members and roommates and colleagues. So if your group has a rule that information is you can't share it with other people in your agency, then people have to make sure that they're not storing information related to the group on a shared machine. If you are using a phone that your kids also use, you have to make sure nothing from this meeting stays on that phone. If you have to make sure your phone is passcoded so other people can't get into it. You should have your organization, if they're allowing you to use your personal devices to do meetings, they should at least have some kind of process for you to notify them if your device is lost or stolen, and then ideally your permission to wipe the device so that protected information goes away. This is, I will say, so under the HIPAA rule, which is the medical privacy rule, if there is a breach of information, all of the medical providers are required to report that to the federal government, and then there's an investigation. And I read whatever reports they put out about those investigations. And I will say the number one thing that happens is somebody's laptop or cell phone is stolen out of their car or lost. And then it comes out that it wasn't protected. There wasn't a system to wipe it, and there wasn't a way. And so suddenly you've got a HIPAA violation and a data breach that sometimes could be a data breach for the whole healthcare organization, because the way information was being used on the device was not sufficiently protective. We're not going to do a deep dive on what are the technological possibilities. You should all in your organizations have somebody who's there to help you maintain your technology, or maybe you've got someone on contract who helps you to maintain your technology. Have a conversation with what steps do we need to be taking routinely, not just once, but maybe once a quarter, to make sure that our machines are secure if we're going to be putting confidential information on them. But for all the time and energy that we focus on the technology, it is way more common that people make user error mistakes, right? So I can tighten the gaskets under my sink all I want, but if my kid leaves the faucet on, actually, who are we kidding? I'm the biggest space cadet in my house. I'm the one who's more likely to start running a bath and forget, right? I'm going to flood the bathroom. So we have to be paying attention to how do users use their machines. And I'm gonna give some examples right now, because especially with the meetings, the virtual meetings, and how simple things like Zoom make it to be on a phone or on a laptop or on a tablet, it is really easy to expose information without realizing it. So when we think about how do we use the equipment to do video meetings, thinking about equipment maintenance, we want to make a choice about which video conference platform to use that has appropriate encryption. And appropriate is a really important word. Encryption is this term that gets thrown around a lot. And the real question you care about when you're running a video conference is, can I tell who can see what's happening? Do I know, and do I have control over who can see what's happening? So one of the things Zoom does is nobody can see what you're doing on Zoom unless you know that they're in the room, right? They get identified on the participant list. You have the ability to set up waiting rooms so that people can't get in without you approving them. So in terms of like the video meetings that are platforms that are available, I cannot recommend highly enough the folks at NNEDV's safety net team, because they are constantly paying attention to what are the various platforms that are available and trying to keep up with all of the changes that are getting made. And it's interesting, I've noticed some people have a policy like, we never meet on Zoom. We can't meet on Zoom. And that is really a holdover from the very beginning of the pandemic. Before Zoom had waiting rooms, they have, I mean, I'm not pitching them, but they have been very attentive to making changes to address security and control of the users. So it's worth paying attention to their improvements and not just assuming that the March 2020 version didn't work, so we should never touch it again. But the other thing I would say about choosing a video conference platform is that often the most famous one isn't necessarily the best. So there are some that have been designed to be more protective for healthcare settings, or even more importantly, for mental health settings or for victim services settings, but they tend not to be as heavily marketed. They tend not to be as free. There's usually a cost associated, but they can be very protective. And the folks at Safety Net keep track of that. And I'm going to show you a slide, just a couple slides. I'm going to show you how to get to their online resources, but I'm also going to give you their email. Anytime you have a technology and confidentiality when working with violence survivors question, safetynet@nnedv.org is, for my money, like the best resources, because this is what all they're getting funding specifically to keep track of how do survivors use technology, how does technology get used against survivors, and how do professionals use technology to serve survivors. So they tend to have better information than anyone else. Their focus is victim services providers, not necessarily HIPAA providers, but the victim services providers regulations around protecting information tend to be stricter than HIPAA. However, in video meetings, again, I think the biggest issue that folks face is user error. So if anyone on this call is running meetings, I really want you to pay attention to this. You got to run your meeting. So if somebody who you didn't know who they were walked into the room when you were about to hold an in-person meeting, you would say, "Excuse me, can I help you? This is a private meeting. Are you really looking for something else?" And maybe the person would say, "Oh, I'm here from the agency, so-and-so couldn't be here today, I'm here instead." Right? Maybe that's why they're there, but maybe they're genuinely lost. And there's no business for them to be in that room. It's interesting to me to see folks on video meetings not do the same thing. Like they'll see a name on the video meeting that isn't someone they expected at the meeting. And a lot of times they will just let it ride. I was just in a meeting the other day. There were only 4 people supposed to be there, and there was a 5th name on there, and everybody just dove in. And I was like, "Excuse me, I just want to make sure I know who's here. Who's the 5th person?" And it turned out 2 of the people in the room knew who that person was, but the other person had no idea and said nothing. So it can feel socially awkward to check in. It's why if you are running the meeting, it's so important to use a waiting room, manage your waiting room. But if anybody shows up and you are like, "How did that person get here? I don't know who that person is," ask. Sometimes what will happen is somebody will be having trouble and they'll still be on the meeting on their laptop, but then they'll sign in also from their phone. Send them a chat message, check in. Is that what's happening? Make sure, again, don't make exceptions. And Anna just said in the chat that this happened at a previous job in organizing and advocacy. Someone joined who ended up sharing explicit videos. Yeah, there was a real issue, especially early in the pandemic. It's actually why they created waiting rooms of people Zoom bombing, showing up in meetings. But again, to a large extent, the reason that could happen is because whoever was running the meeting didn't have a sense of who they thought should be there. And when they saw a name they didn't recognize, they didn't say, "I don't know who this is." Now, at the time, Zoom didn't make it nearly as easy to get rid of those people. Zoom has now put in a whole bunch of security measures to kick people out quickly and to keep them out of the room. Yes. So I think it's worth it if your group is going to meet via Zoom to check out what are the mechanisms that it provides, because there are a lot of really good ones that you can use and pay attention to. But the other thing that comes up is that people are using their own devices in a room where there are other people, right? You might be officing in a place where there's, you're in a cubicle and there's another person in the cubicle, or another person is kind of sort of joining the meeting, but no one is quite sure why they're there. You got to ask, kind of settle up who's in the room in the beginning. I think asking people to use earbuds so that other folks in their setting can't hear them. Asking people to pay attention to where their screen is facing and can anybody behind them see what's happening on their screen. Again, this can be part of your MOU. This can be part of your recitation of confidentiality at the beginning of a meeting. Are you set up in a space where other people can't hear you or see your screen? I mean, that could be a really simple question to ask everybody to confirm. Are you in a space where other people cannot hear you or hear the rest of us or see your screen?
You know, I think that's
yes.
one thing that's really challenging for many folks in hybrid situations. You know, when I started working from home pre-pandemic, it was really easy to close the door, and most of the time I was the only one there. And so then the idea of headphones prevents sharing the people in the what's being, but it doesn't block what I'm saying to
Exactly.
the group.
Exactly.
And so that's something that's difficult. And I think for folks in office settings, most of them do not have, you know, personal spaces. I know that Bernadette will go to a room that's private when she and I have our one-on-ones. Many of our other grantees will take the opportunity to that be a work from home day kind of thing, so that they can say that. Yeah, and Mindy, you get people coming in for resources all the time and all that kind of stuff, and you know, sometimes you can control that and sometimes you can't. So you know, it's not always an easy fix, I think.
It's not always easy. I think more than anything else, we have to pay attention to it and think about it in advance. I mean, I hold a meeting in my closet in my bedroom like once a week because it's the best place to record. And I'm recording a podcast, right? But it's really, I think one of the things that's nice about the world right now is we're all just a lot more human in a way. And it is much more acceptable to be like, I'm meeting from my closet because it's the best place. But also Zoom updated it so you can blur your background. So you might know you're in your closet, but they don't have to know. I mean, is it super fun being in my closet? Maybe not, but I know it's the best space to do it, right? I have made a conscious and thoughtful choice among the options available to me. This is the best one. If you're in an organization where you work in an open office or a cubicle, there should be some space that your organization has set aside for someone to have private meetings. Heck, kick your boss out of their office. Say, you asked me to be on this confidential MDT, I'm on it. You got to give me a private space. And if the only one available is your office, so be it. Or you reserve the client meeting space. Like, you got to have conversations. If your team is going to ask you to participate in these meetings and they're going to be virtual, then you need to have a conversation with your boss. What is the strategy for me to represent our organization in the best possible way? All right, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these tips. You guys are going to get a PDF of the slides, so you'll be able to think about these tips. This is how you can get technical assistance on choosing technology. There are lots of resources on techsafety.org, but also the email that I sent you, safetynet@NNEDV, is a great way for asking questions. We're going to think for a minute about managing the meetings. Again, we've already talked quite a bit about who should be here. And we talked a little bit last week about maybe there are some meetings where there are people who are on the team and they are valued members of the team, but they shouldn't be here today because today's meeting purpose is different. So the virtual makes that even a little bit more complicated, like paying attention, like, hey, I see you there, Bob. I know we normally meet on Tuesdays. Today is a meeting where we've concluded the only folks should be here are on the healthcare mental health team. Thanks. See you next week, right? Have a plan for all to contribute. So how are you going to think about everybody being able to share information, to speak, to hear, or to have closed captioning? Make sure you're thinking about accommodations for everybody who is on your team and how using this technology might change the accommodations that people need. Although a lot of times the technology can end up being assistive, but you just need to know they need it to make sure that the right things are turned on in your platform. Here's the next thing. I cannot recommend this more strongly. If one person is on video, everyone is on their own video. It is Not ideal to have meetings where 3 people are in a room together and then someone else is on video. You all know, if you've ever, in the before times, there was ever a meeting where there were 10 people in the room and 1 person on conference call, and it was impossible to participate, right? Really, really hard. I once participated in a group because of logistics. It was 11 people in a room dealing with a really hard issue, and me on television at the end of the table. Terrible. As someone who has a hearing impairment, which I do, when other people are in the room and they're not individually mic'd on their own device, I can't hear what anybody's saying to each other. And so it makes it really difficult for me to participate, but it also makes me feel left out. So there are lots of technology companies that have been meeting virtually for many years, and they have had a rule forever that says, I don't care if 2 people have an office next to each other and the other person's on the other side of the country, there will be 3 separate devices logging in. And I actually work with a group in New York I've been working with for years, and that's how they've always run it. And those are very strong working relationships. So if it's really necessary to have 2 people on a device participating in a meeting, I suppose that lessens the problem, because the 2 people can sit right in front of the device, but it's not ideal. Have really clear expectations. You would hope that no one would do this, like try to take a call while driving somewhere, but we all know the way we've started multitasking, right? I'm like, well, if I can get my kid to the orthodontist and then take a meeting in the waiting room, why not? You need to have conversations about what the boundaries are there, what is or is not okay. Don't assume that people will just use good judgment. I once had somebody in a training that was by definition interactive. We sent out a gazillion notices saying you're going to be thinking the whole time, you're going to be making choices, you're going to be involved. And somebody texted me and said, great, I'm really looking forward to it. I'll just be driving somewhere while we do this. And I was like, I respectfully, I don't want you to come today because it's not a good fit. So make sure you have conversations with people about what counts as okay or not okay, about where they are with their device and whether in transit would ever be okay or not. And then sort of these final screens are really about just some tips for thinking about how are we doing this in the human way. So when you're on screen, your face is much more prominent. As I have learned, because I can't really ever hide what I'm thinking. Have guidelines about what's appropriate with screens on, screens off, giving people permission if they feel the need to be off screen, whether that's okay or not. Or you might have a rule that says we all got to be on screen so we know we're all here. You have to figure out with your group what makes sense. I do think sort of giving people space, if you're talking about violence, sometimes people need space to not be on screen. Also teaching everybody how to mute their own screen so you can let everybody else see you, but you don't see you, which is, how we did meetings forever. Instead of obsessing about how our own hair looks, which I don't mean our, I mean mine. Everybody's got their own issues. If, I'm not assuming that you should or you are, but if you're going to be using any graphic images, such as photos of injuries that has something to do with what your group is talking about, let people know it is a different thing to have that suddenly pop up on screen. So, kind of a content warning, a discussion, and don't just leave it up. I will say lawyers can get really hardened to the images that they are using as evidence. And I have seen prosecutors put up, because it related to a speech, I've seen prosecutors put up a photo of a woman with very severe injuries on a giant hotel slide shot and then present for an hour with that picture up. And I genuinely don't know if that was on purpose or not, but I don't recommend it. It is upsetting and it's distracting and it's not necessary. And it is invasive to the person with the injuries to have that stuff being exposed for 1 second longer than is actually needed.
Can I ask a question? I'm sorry.
Of course, yes.
I'm just curious about those individuals who call into the meeting versus coming on, camera or what have you. I had a similar incident in a meeting and I had to remove the person because they had no way of identifying themselves and didn't, I guess they were driving, so they couldn't unmute and say who they were.
Right.
Would you recommend not doing the call-in?
So I think that's a little bit hard because when we're talking about bad bandwidth, for some people, calling in is going to be the only way to access. And so I think it's a conversation. So first off, a conversation about whether it's appropriate to try to attend the meeting in transit would have helped on that one. I think if maybe what you want to do is if people are going to call in, they need to tell you in advance. I'm going to be calling in. This is the reason. It's the only way I can participate. I think I would generally discourage it. But if someone says, oh, it's the only way I can participate, I'm going to be calling in, and this is the phone number you can expect to see me calling from. I think that's a reasonable way to do it. It's kind of asking people to plan. Maybe, depending on the size of your group, if you know the phone numbers of the people in the group, so that if somebody has a web bandwidth problem, you kind of know what their backup plan would be. And again, sometimes we're just making judgment calls in the moment. I think when you're making judgment calls in the moment, not disclosing information and being overly cautious to prevent disclosure is the right thing in the moment. And then you can always have a conversation later and say, hey, somebody says, you shut me out of the meeting. And you're like, oh, I wouldn't even apologize. I would say, that's because I didn't know who you were. It's really unfortunate you didn't get to be at the rest of the meeting. Let's talk about how we could do this differently or better next time. But I think you want to own and be proud of being careful. Because it is that worry that we're going to be socially awkward or make somebody feel bad that causes us to let people stay in meetings who are actually Zoom bombers or are wildly inappropriate. That example I gave the other day of saying, hey, there's a fifth person here and I don't know who it is. It actually took me 10 minutes to do it. And I was really nervous. And we were literally not discussing, and it was like my contract for a training was all we were discussing. But I was nervous that it would come across as rude. So when we worry about the social interactions, that's when we're not as careful or cautious. And you can just tell the team, hey, if I'm running the meeting and I can't tell who you are, I'm going to cut you out. And you can reach out to me later, or you can send me a text that says, hey, it's me. And it's not about you personally. It's about being protective of our space.
So one of the things that I've found since the pandemic is that law enforcement are much more likely to attend a meeting when they're out and about, and then can call in from their phone or Zoom in from their phone, in a McDonald's parking lot or whatever, because they don't have to do the travel time. They don't have to do, and I think some APS folks who are having to be tied to their desk phone at a time are also very grateful of it. But I'm real worried about the mixed format time because I think as we move into coming out of the pandemic, we're always going to have folks who are much more comfortable online, and people who are much more comfortable. And I don't know that it's within our ability to say that it's one way or another. I think we're moving into a more hybrid, a more multi-platform format. And I too hear you, because I too have a hearing loss, and have sat through those miserable ones where I'm the only one, and I hear 50% of the meeting. So anyway, I know we're at time, but I'll just say I don't know that we've got a good answer for that one yet.
I agree. I agree. It's going to be a process. And so being human and being process, setting the tone, project coordinators get to set the tone. And some of the ways you set tone is by having conversations in advance and naming why you're doing things the way you're doing. One last thing that I will say is discourage private chat. People do dumb, terrible things on private chat, me included, and then accidentally sort of send a snarky, inappropriate response to the whole group instead of just the person they were inappropriately privately chatting with. So discourage private chat in your platform, and ask people for focus. Ask for it. Say, we want you here. And so can you ask for no multitasking in the same way that you would be able to ask for no multitasking if you were in a room together? Bring the same level of attention. And if people can't give that, then maybe they're not the right fit for the team. And, nobody's going to give it 100%. Nobody gave 100% of focus in an in-person meeting either. But when you set the culture, you're going to get it more often than you would otherwise. These slides are just going to get back to what we talked about last week about clear MOUs, really thinking about what is appropriate to be brought into the meeting, what is appropriate to be carried out of the meeting, having a real group consensus about that, not making assumptions, which means you got to make time and space for those conversations, and assume turnover. Assume you will have turnover. I mean, we're all living turnover right now, right? So you need a way to recommit to norms with new people, and even with old people. Their brains tend to tune out after a while. And so making sure that you're always building culture. Okay, these are like really tight focus sessions. I spent a lot of time having our discussion about what you're already doing in the beginning, and that was super important to me. I am happy to stay on for a couple of more minutes and answer any questions for anyone who has it, but you also are always welcome to email me, alicia@confidentialityinstitute.org. I receive funding through the OVW and the National Network to End Domestic Violence to help folks who are working on violence issues to think about confidentiality. So when you reach out to me, you're not taking advantage of me. You're asking me to do my job. I like my job. But I don't share what we talk about. So I report back. I talked to somebody at a domestic violence program in Kansas about releases. So if you want to talk to me about something that's sensitive or maybe you're nervous or worried about, I can tell you right now, I do not voluntarily share that with the funders. And I know people have schedules. And again, one of the downsides to our virtual world is I didn't always like travel time, but boy, travel time was downtime. And we've all lost downtime because we're scheduling our meetings back to back. So you could have that culture conversation with people, like how can we schedule meetings where there's a break? We're asking all of us to build in a break. Tell your team the meeting is 20 minutes longer than it really is, end the meeting on time, and then they've got a 20-minute break that you just bought for them. All right, there is an evaluation link in the chat. Thank you very much, everybody, for doing the evaluation. It helps us know if this is meeting your needs and how we can make it better in the future.
Alicia, as always, thank you so much for helping people think and sharing your expertise with them. And and thanks for being a resource to them moving forward. I really appreciate that.
Of course. Thank you guys for having me. I enjoy it. All right, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you so much. Have a good one, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Take care.